Well, a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to our second conversation of the day. How's everyone doing so far? Okay, maybe we had a little heavy lunch there, maybe an extra little too much champagne and wine being handed out the back there. How's everyone doing today so far? Hopefully you're all settled in and relaxing and enjoying this wonderful voyage. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as I said earlier today, we pride ourselves on having the best of the best, and we had Dr. Laura Weeks start off our conversation earlier with understanding Buddhist art. Now, if you didn't catch that one, we do record these live, and they play on your in-suite television, so you might be able to go back and catch these a little bit later. And then, of course, we're about to kick off Mr. Andrew Johnson's coming up. But then tonight as well, everyone, we have the wonderful Craig Weldon. He's a retired Army general, and he is going to be talking all about his experience with being at the Pentagon during 9/11. So that's at 6:15 tonight, so don't miss that wonderful, wonderful conversation as well. But in the meantime, without further ado, as I said, we pride ourselves on having the best, and this gentleman has been with us for several years, talking about history and culture and how it pertains to where we're sailing. So please give a wonderful, warm, seaborne welcome to Andrew Johnson.
Thank you, Matt. I have the privilege and pleasure of traveling with Kathy, my wife, who is out there somewhere, over there. Kathy and I research together, so it's very much a team effort and great for both of us. The countries of Southeast Asia are heavily influenced by their European colonial history and by other local impacts as well. Borders have changed as they do around the world, and controls of places have changed. Today I plan to focus on one of the stories that left its mark on this part of the world. And I'm going to be talking about some others during the next couple of weeks as well. I'm also picking up a little of Laurel's talk this morning because there are important Buddhist aspects to the history of tea. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a charter to the British East India Company. Now, it was originally chartered as the governor and company of merchants of London trading into the East Indies. The company rose to account for half of the world's trade and to control a major part of this part of Asia, from India and well beyond. By 1825, the company realized that it needed money to be able to do the things that it felt necessary, because it was effectively the government of these British colonies, but operating on commercial grounds. And as a result, it developed an illegal opium trade with China. I don't have samples today, just to be clear. And also, for those of you who were in trivia this morning, I'd just like to point out I'm not talking about tea bags. For those of you who weren't in trivia this morning, it might be as well if we just let that one go. But let me tell you a little bit about myself, first of all. I am not an academic. My background is in commerce. I was an international chief executive. I started in the travel industry, and indeed one of my colleagues is on board with us, traveling purely coincidentally. I moved into the automobile clubs to run, or to work in and later to run the travel businesses there, and ended up coordinating and controlling the automobile club's activities in Europe. So for those of you from North America, it's the European equivalent of the AAA, roughly the same size, about 65 million motorists and members. The CAA in Canada, the AAA in Australia and elsewhere, with public lobbying responsibilities. And we lived in Brussels for several years doing that. In terms of my own expertise and experience, I was educated in business and in economics. I studied behavioral sciences, and for some years now I've been a life coach and executive mentor, as well as keynote speaking as well. Today, Kathy and I live in Spain, and we have done for nearly 20 years now. We live quite close to the city of Valencia, about halfway down the Mediterranean coast. Now, I am interested in language. It comes largely from having lived and worked in a multilingual, multicultural society. And I get a bit of fun exchanging comments with our friends. And we would have dinner occasionally with the whole team in Brussels and just bounce ideas across. And there was a restaurant that we absolutely loved called Opium Jan, which literally translates as high as 3 apples. And that is the French equivalent of the English expression, knee-high to a grasshopper. So you might say to a child who's very small, you're knee-high to a grasshopper. In French, they would say, Opium Jan, as high as 3 apples. That sort of thing interests me. But I'm also interested in my own language as other people use it. And my friend Hugh sent this that he photographed in Savannah in Georgia. And it says, "Save the Earth, it's the only planet with wine." Now, that may not be the best reason to be environmentally friendly, but it's just a nice use of language. And then another friend sent me this photo suggesting that this particular product isn't such a good deterrent of dogs who want to go chewing. Now, back to our story. Well, seaborne ships travel all over the world, the routes of many of the explorers and traders that I'm going to touch on over the next few days. I will focus on the activities in these waters, but I'll have to bring in a little of some of the background as well. Tea did not begin in Africa, in India, in the Philippines, in Thailand, Malaysia, the Carolinas, or Sri Lanka, which is where a lot of our tea comes from today. For the origins, we have to go back many centuries and close to these waters, particularly the China Seas. The actual origin of tea as a drink isn't recorded accurately in history, but it is recorded in legend. And it's certain that it began in ancient China about 5,000 years ago, possibly longer than that. And the story goes that an elderly emperor named Shannong was visiting a distant part of his realm. And serendipity one day caused a discovery that would spread in popularity all over the world. The story is that Shannong, who was very interested in science and was ahead of his time in believing that things should be treated hygienically. So he insisted that all the drinking water that he and his court would consume must first be boiled. He didn't know why, but he believed that it would make it safer. So one day, out somewhere in the wilds, in the cold climates to the north of his kingdom, his servants were boiling water to enable them to drink it. And while they did, a wind blew up and leaves from nearby trees started to blow, and some of those fell into the water and infused the water. The bush from which those leaves came was a member of the camellia family. Tea is from the camellia family. And camellias like to grow on cooler slopes. So they like to be well watered, they like a bit of sunshine, and they like cool nights especially. As a scientist, the emperor was interested. In fact, he was fascinated. Suddenly there was this lightly colored water, and he decided he was going to risk drinking some. He found it refreshing, and despite it still being warm, he found it cooling. And so, according to the narrative, tea was born. Over thousands of years, the tea culture has spread throughout Chinese life. But it was not until the year 800 that the scholar Lu Yu wrote the first definitive work on the subject. He called it Cha Jing, which means tea book or the book of tea. He was an orphan. He was raised by Buddhists in one of China's very fine monasteries. He was a rebel, he was a skilled observer, and he achieved acclaim also as a performer. And the Japanese Buddhist priest, took the first seeds back with him to Japan. He was thereafter known throughout Japan as the father of tea. So the subtly captivating qualities of the very lightly flavoured teas that they were drinking, generally green teas rather than black. And within Japanese society, this spread quite quickly outside of the monasteries. Since that time, tea in Japan has always been associated with Zen Buddhism, hence the link to the Buddha that we were talking about this morning. The calming influence of tea was known a long time ago, and the Japanese tea ceremony was created. The Japanese tea ceremony, which is known as cha-no-yu, which literally translates as the hot water for tea, because it's all about preparing the water and the atmosphere. The tea ceremony requires years of training, and when you see it, you might wonder why. But there's a lot of practice, and it is reported that the whole art signifies no more than the making and serving of a cup of tea. The supremely important matter is that the act be performed in the most perfect, most polite, most graceful, most charming manner possible. The ceremony's greatest practitioners have always been philosophers, artists, connoisseurs, collectors, gardeners, calligraphers, gourmets, and those practicing ikebana, the flower arrangers. The greatest of them, Senriku, left a tantalizing but simple set of instructions. He said, to make a delicious bowl of tea, lay the charcoal so that it heats the water. Arrange the flowers as they are in the field. In summer, suggest coolness. In winter, suggest warmth. Do everything ahead of time. Prepare for rain, and give to those with whom you find yourself. Tea came to Europe very slowly. At first there were rumours, there were stories about it, there were whispers. But the first European to take tea back, having first taken tea, and to document it was the Portuguese Jesuit father, Jasper de Cruz, and that was in the 1550s. He was a missionary visiting China, and later the Portuguese developed a trade route and shipped tea to Lisbon. That enterprise was repeated by the Dutch, and as a result, tea became available in France, in the Netherlands, in Portugal, and beyond, later into England as well. Now, at this time, of course, tea was a very precious and expensive commodity. When it first came to Europe, and later when it first came to America, it was really only the very privileged who could consider consuming this. It was kept in locked caddies, much as you might have a locked Tantalus for your best whiskey today. And it was only served in the very best china cups. Now, originally, I'm sure you know, tea was served in china tea bowls. Bowls imported from China or from Japan. You may remember the story of the Nanking cargo, which was named after the type of porcelain. It was found in the Dutch East India Company ship, the Geldermalsen. It sank near Java in 1751, and it was salvaged in 1985. The cargo was sold by Christie's in Amsterdam. 2,800 lots. It took 5 days in April and May 1986 to complete the sale, and some $20 million was raised in the auction. Companies like Wedgwood, Sèvres, Meissen, they all copied the Chinese and Japanese designs to make cups, which later, of course, had handles and saucers. And at first, of course, it was only possible for the very rich and very privileged to be able to have these. But later, with the introduction of mass production techniques, more ordinary folk were able to have something that approximated to what the rich might use. How did tea come to be served in America? Well, it was this man, Peter Stuyvesant. He lived from 1592 till 1672. And he took the first tea to the colonists in the Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam. I'm sure you know that New Amsterdam was later to be known as New York. And the reason that that happened was because New Amsterdam was exchanged between the Dutch and the British for the spice island of Rum, which is not that far from where we are it's not just around the corner, but it's not that far away. The Dutch settlers were avid tea drinkers. They'd been drinking tea at home for a while, and the English, when they acquired the colony, discovered that more tea was drunk in this relatively small settlement than in all of England at the time. And this led to taxation on the tea. And you will remember, I'm sure, the stories of no taxation without representation, and one of the most famous tea incidents in history. I'm not going into the political background of that here. Now, the age of tea clippers was really quite short. It only lasted about 2 decades. But the romance of the tea clippers went into legend and history. And the brief reign was marked by a lot of excitement and enthusiasm, because these ships and their cargo were something very special and really quite new. It's gone down in history, famed for the glamour and the romance. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the British East India Company, properly named the Honourable East India Company, known by many as the Honourable Company, and by a lot simply as the Company. So the Company had the monopoly on British trade with China and India. Because no other company could legally import goods from these countries, there really wasn't much of a hurry to get the things home. So they would transport the merchandise in the most economic way possible. So its priority was to minimize costs. They would carry as much as they could on board their ships, and the result of that was that the ships were heavily laden and were really quite slow. Its ships were known as East Indiamen. They were very big, they were strong, but they were very slow. By 1800, the average East Indiaman could carry 1,200 tons of cargo. And the trading pattern for China tea usually meant that these ships set sail from Britain in January, round the Cape of Good Hope at the southernmost tip of Africa, and arrived in China in September. They would load up that year's tea harvest and then set off again for the return journey. And depending on the wind and the weather, they would expect to arrive back in Britain by the following September. So even with favourable sailing conditions, the round trip took almost 2 years. And if anything went wrong, it could take an awful lot longer. By 1834, the company had lost its trading monopolies, and tea had become a freely traded item. The company had no more use for its great ships, sold them off, and many were bought by merchants, or by their captains even, who continued to plough the seas between Britain and China, plying the tea trade. But now the tea could be traded freely. A few canny sailors began to realize that with faster ships, whoever brought the tea back first, especially for the new harvest, would be able to make more money, because the practicalities, if you were home first, you could sell your shipment of tea before your competitors even arrived, and partly because consumers were starting to appreciate that fresher tea would taste better. So these lumbering East Indiamen became less appealing, and tea traders wanted faster, sleeker ships to bring their precious cargo back. Nonetheless, the idea really only caught on quite slowly in Britain, And while the 1840s saw a few faster ships launched, for the time being, many merchants were satisfied with the slow, reliable, but rather lumbering hulks that they'd been using for a while. The first true clipper was Rainbow. It was designed by John W. Griffiths and launched in 1845. She made the journey from New York to Canton in 102 days. That took more than 2 weeks off the previous record for that trip. The development was given another boost by the discovery of gold in California in 1848 and in Australia in 1851. People were rushing to seek their fortunes. They wanted to travel fast as well. I'm going to come back to the story of gold in, I think, my next talk, when I look at the Spanish and Portuguese influences in this area and beyond. T-clippers were then designed and were built in Britain as well as in America. They were being built during the 1850s and 1860s. They had a narrower beam than the American equivalents, which made them slower in heavy weather, but much faster in good weather. So if they had lighter winds, the British English ships were much faster. And there was a great spirit of competition between the British and American ships that were plying the tea trade. But to begin with, the Americans had the edge. Then in 1851, the British ship owner Richard Green announced that he was fed up hearing about the dismal prospects for British shipping, which really came about since the repeal of the navigation laws. And so he built an aptly named ship called the Challenge, with the stated intention of beating the American ships. He left Canton for London in 1852, loaded with tea, and this ship fell in with an American clipper called, the English clipper was called Challenger, the American clipper was called Challenge, just to confuse things a bit. And the American clipper was a bit bigger, a bit older, but had already proved herself on the seas and was admired for her speed. Lots of money was bet on which would make it back to London first. And in the end, it was the British Challenger. They beat the US Challenge by 2 days. And there was, you can imagine, quite a bit of pleasure in London at that news. They thundered down through these seas, the South China Seas, into the Indian Ocean, across round the southernmost tip of Africa, round the Cape of Good Hope, then northbound through the vast Atlantic, past the Azores, into the English Channel and into the Thames estuary. And from there, they would be towed up the Thames by Thames tugs. Clipper races became quite the thing and attracted public imagination. The speed, the rivalry, the thrills, while the ships themselves were getting increasingly beautiful as well as getting increasingly fast. There would be certain marker points on the way, and from there telegrams would be sent to report the progress. And when the first clippers were due to arrive in London, the race would be a central topic of conversation. The betting would increase. Crowds would gather at the docks to watch the arrival of the ships. And the ships were painted, the masts and bulwarks were painted in different colours so that you could recognise that's the blue and therefore it's this ship, or that's the red and therefore it's that one. There were great cheers as the ships progressed up the Thames, and particularly as they came into London. There was so much enthusiasm in the public that big amounts of money could be won or more often lost. So that's how tea clippers came about, but their reign was really quite limited, principally because of the arrival of two factors. The first was motorized steam craft, and the second was the Suez Canal. It wasn't possible easily to navigate clippers through the Suez Canal. You just don't get the winds. More importantly, it was possible to navigate steam craft through there. They didn't need the vast quantities of coke to get round southern Africa, which impacted on their loading capabilities. So they could take a lighter load of fuel and a heavier load of the cargo that they were paid to carry. So these pretty plodding steamships as they were had none of the glamour of the clippers. They didn't require the brave and skilled crews that the clippers did. But neither did they have the same competition between them. There were challenges, there were races, but nothing that gripped the public imagination like the clipper races. Today there is just one tea clipper remaining, and that's this one in Greenwich in London. It's the Cutty Sark. She was launched from the Clyde, that's the river coming out from Glasgow, on the 22nd of November in 1869. Built for John Whitehat Willis, who was a shipping magnate, the intention was that she would win the annual clipper race. Actually, as it happens, she never beat her arch rival, Thermopolis. But the decline of the clipper tea trade meant that the Cutty Sark only carried tea until 1877. She survived various later incarnations in various other ways. But today, Cutty Sark is the only remaining tea clipper in the world. She looks so small. I mean, would almost fit in this grand salon. It is not a massive craft. You may remember that there was a fire on board in her dry dock in Greenwich a few years ago, and the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, led the campaign for her restoration, which happened well. And so today you can now visit the Cutty Sark again if you're in London. But let's go back to the story of tea, back in time. To grow well, tea requires cooler nights and it requires rainfall. Lots of great varieties of wine require the same thing. So tea plantations tend to be on hills and tend to be away from the coast. This is how tea was traditionally transported down those hills and along the tea route. Language was not the major obstacle for the British doing business with the Chinese. The biggest obstacle was currency. The goods that the British had to offer in trade were mainly English broadcloth, which really wasn't at all attractive in the semi-tropical areas, Canton, which is where most of the trade was done, and they weren't allowed to sell it further inland in the bitterly cold northern parts of China, where I guess woolen cloth might be appreciated. Instead, the British discovered that the Chinese quite liked opium, which they were able to grow in the Middle East, what we now know as Pakistan, Afghanistan, and northern India. So the beverage that John Wesley, the Methodist evangelist, was urging his flocks to drink in the name of temperance in England was purchased at the cost of drug addiction on the other side of the world. Having addicted the greater part of the English-speaking world to tea, the British East India Company managed to proceed to addict its Chinese suppliers to another of its commodities, opium. The drug was all but unknown in China at the time. Until the 1600s, it was actually the Dutch who mediated one of the probably most evil cultural exchanges in history. They brought in opium from the Middle East and Native American tobacco pipe, brought the two together in China. And soon, China was growing tobacco, but it was only a matter of time before the Chinese demanded more and more opium, and they never managed to grow opium themselves. Thanks to its control of India, the company had a virtual monopoly on opium. This being before the days of electronic banking, these firms were happy to let the company apply against their bills in London as much of their silver in Canton as it needed. So thereby they spared themselves the perilous necessity of actually transporting silver one way or the other. So they actually collected silver in payment for its opium, and then paid out silver in payment for the tea. The same silver, which didn't actually leave the warehouse most of the time. The silver circulated, but pretty much it stayed where it was. Sluggishly, the emperor responded, but really slowly. He saw the debauching of his people. In 1800, he forbade the importing of opium under the severest penalties. The only result was that the emperor was henceforth defrauded of what should have been his rightful import duty on it. Opium was no longer brought to the Canton anchorage, but to little islands where it was transshipped ashore, and there were many back pockets lined to ensure that this happened, including many of the emperor's own officials. Chinese referred to it as foreign mud. Any fair-minded student of imperialism would probably have to admit that the British did try very hard to open up a more regular form of commerce with China. But their diplomatic efforts, though unflagging, were viewed by the Chinese as simply the acts of barbarians bearing tribute. This illustration is called the reception. It's a caricature of the reception that Lord Macartney received from the Kailong Emperor, drawn by a famous British cartoonist of the time, James Gilray. What the British wanted most was for the emperor to legalize opium, and one emperor after another steadfastly refused to do it. So the British response was to corrupt the whole of government. The customs, the officials, the senior officers, the court of the emperor, and it is suggested the emperor himself. In the late 1820s, the company was exporting less than 10,000 cases of opium annually. By 1870, this rose to over 100,000, roughly 13 times the quantity, and all of it to China. The Chinese were very good at self-deception. While every one of their officials was on the take, they just turned their back and allowed it to happen. Tens of thousands of chests of opium passed through their hands every season. But to quote J.M. Scott, of the tea being drunk in the West at Methodist and anti-slavery meetings, in fine drawing rooms and poor cottages, nearly all of it was bought with opium. Trading opium into China was a lucrative but illegal business, and two Scotsmen involved in the trade played quite a crucial role, especially in the onset of war. William Jardine, who was a former ship surgeon turned private trader from Dumfriesshire in Scotland, and James Matheson, a trader from Sutherland, became business partners after first meeting in a Chinese brothel. In 1832, they formed Jardine, Matheson and Company, based in Canton in southern China. Canton, you probably know, is now known as Guangzhou. They were in the 13 Factories district, which was the only area of the city where foreigners could trade. Their business empire extended to Singapore, Bangkok and Kuala Lumpur. And today Jardine Matheson is a major financial services business here and in London. By the end of the 18th century, Britain imported over £6 million of tea a year from Canton. And as I've already said, China would accept only silver as payment. Britain offered to trade. They offered Wedgwood pottery, they offered scientific instruments, woolen goods. All of it was declined. And Emperor Qianlong wrote in a letter to King George III, "We possess all things and of the highest quality. I set no value on strange and useless objects and have no use of your country's manufactures." The coastal location of Canton made smuggling really very easy for the British. They'd transfer the goods to smaller boats that could make it up the coast, small row-powered craft. Always someone there to help bring in the drugs and to hide it. But the British law breaking hadn't gone unnoticed. In 1839, the Emperor declared a war on drugs. The Opium War of 1839 was effectively a skirmish between the British authorities and ships wanting to trade cargoes other than opium. Foreign ships to be allowed to dock in Canton for trade, the Chinese required a signed bond agreed not to trade opium. And the British trade authorities insisted that perpetrators should not sign that because they would be executed. Both sides knew that there was a major crisis coming. The British weren't worried because they despised China's weakness, while on their part, the Chinese weren't worried because they believed they were invincible, as they had been in the past. The Second Opium War, when it finally came a year later, dispelled those Chinese illusions. The traders of the 13 factories warehouse district in Canton were locked in by the Chinese army. They were forced to surrender. Goods with a value of £2 million were seized, including some 42,000 opium pipes and 20,000 chests of opium. Incensed by the seizures, William Jardine left Canton for London. He lobbied his friend, the Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston, to strike back at China. Gladstone and Disraeli argued the morals of the trade in Parliament, but with opium responsible for a significant part of British India's tax revenues, it didn't take long for the government to send in the navy. In June 1840, the British fleet of 16 warships and 27 transports carrying 4,000 men arrived in the Pearl River Delta near Humen. Among them was the Nemesis. She was a new iron warship, and she was armed with a deadly weapon, the Congreve rocket launcher, which was able to fire exploding rockets up to a distance of 2 miles, something the Chinese had never imagined possible. It destroyed their fleet. Their static cannons and armada of war junks lasted just 5.5 hours, and over the next 2 years, the British Navy travelled up the coast towards Shanghai. Chinese troops, many of whom were addicted to opium, were overwhelmed at every stage. The British bombardments resulted in a considerable loss of life. It reckoned to be 20 to 25,000 Chinese were killed. Britain lost 69 men. The war was speedily concluded with the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, which was dictated at the point of a few thousand British bayonets. China was forced to accept free trade, dismantled forever the cumbersome Cohong system, recognized foreign consuls, and set up a single low tariff on all imports, whatever they may have been. 4 more Chinese ports were opened up to foreigners, and Hong Kong, across Canton Bay, was ceded to the British by way of reparations, along with an enormous sum of money, some $6 million. Other Western powers soon exacted similar results. Portugal acquired Macau. Shanghai, the European powers, were established in colonial trade. And if European colonialism and imperialism prevailed against the loudly declared Yellow Peril, British troops were to invade repeatedly and were to become known as the White Disaster. They burnt the Summer Palace in Peking. They forced the imperial legalization of opium in 1857. The legacy of opium was profound. The Chinese empire was shattered. Initially, they agreed to open 5 ports to foreign trade and to pay $21 million to the British government as compensation. But for the British, the highlight of the deal was the acquisition of Hong Kong, which of course remained in British control until 25 years ago. And it would be used as the hub to increase trade in opium with China. In some ways, the tea business was the oil business of its day. Questionable trading, questionable military intervention, questionable economics, and certainly questionable employment conditions to give us our afternoon cuppa, or what the Cockneys would call their Rosie Lee. But in time, Britain and its commercial businesses decided that the dependence on China was too great a risk. Tea seeds were smuggled out of China. Tea plantations were installed in British colonial territories. Ceylon in India, both famous today for their blends. Commercial production in Sri Lanka and India began the conquest of large areas by the British East India Company. It was James Taylor, a Scotsman, not the singer, and nor is he the tailor of tailors of Harrogate who make Yorkshire tea today. He's not that family either. But he brought tea to Ceylon, which is now known as Sri Lanka, and in 1867 he started Sri Lanka's first tea estate, some 19 acres. He worked with Sir Thomas Lipton, whose name you might well recognise, and they created massive tranches of tea plantations and shipped it back to the UK and around the world. And then, as demand required a bigger supply to quench the thirst of a growing number of regular tea drinkers, the colonial power looked to other territories to create new and even larger plantations. By the 1914 outbreak of the war to end all wars, if only that were true, tea was firmly established as the refreshment of choice among all social classes of British society, and was gaining popularity all across Europe and across the Atlantic as well. Today, tea is to be found in places like the Boh tea estate in the Malaysian Cameron Highlands, and Malaysia is one of the big tea producers here. It's well known for its fascinating infusion of Malay, Chinese, Indian, and different indigenous cultures into a harmony. Because of the influence of the Dutch East India Company, tea is drunk in the tea houses in Jakarta. And across Indonesia, there are tea plantations. Although coffee is still a larger production there, which is also true of Vietnam. But in Vietnam, the culture, the climate is ideal. Exactly what is needed as you get up into the hills, especially this plantation, the Mok Chau, which is located not too far from Halong Bay in the north. So this is the TWG store in the Swiss hotel, Fairmont Hotel in Singapore. TWG is a very prestigious, very expensive producer of tea. And I was interested when we first saw that Seabourn have chosen them as their tea supplier of choice. When you look at the prices of tea here, you have to assume that Seabourn has done some good negotiating with them, but they do have an excellent range of tea. So if England has English breakfast, India has chai, China has jasmine, the Philippines have a host of different infusions, ginger and turmeric, dragon fruit and various others. And the same is true of Malaysia and many more. And the British Empire colonies in Africa also provided the perfect grounds for tea plantations. Countries such as Kenya, Tanganyika, which is Tanzania today, Nyasaland, which we know as Malawi, Southern Rhodesia, which is now known as Zimbabwe, Uganda, all major producers and exporters of tea because the conditions on the plantations are perfect for growing. The conditions for the workers may not be the best, and we may rightly feel a bit of shame at that. But news travelled quite slowly in those days, and the customers in England and America thought nothing of the labourers' welfare. Orthodox tea refers to hand-processed tea, or tea that's rolled with machinery in a manner that mimics hand-rolling. A lot of the tea that we drink today is CTC, which is machine-rolled and even machine-dried, baked rather than naturally dried. If you buy whole leaf tea, it is almost always orthodox. If you buy tea bags, it's almost always the CTC. So that delightful cuppa, a cup of hot, refreshing tea, has much to answer for. And as you might like to seek out the best afternoon tea in the great hotels in the world, places like Raffles in Singapore, or you might like to pop upstairs in a couple of minutes and enjoy afternoon tea in the observation lounge. Susan Sontag once said, "I haven't been everywhere, but it's on my list." And with that, I must leave you, but I hope that the conversation will continue. Kathy and I are here for a month. We're not rushing off anywhere. We look forward to dining with you, to having a drink with you, to having a cup of tea. Probably not an opium pipe, but we're around. If there are any questions, please do ask them. Thank you very much.